Well, welcome everyone. I'm Jan Holden, Professor Emerita of Counseling from the University of North Texas, serving currently as IANDS President. And I have a special interest in physicians' near-death experiences because a couple reasons. One is that every year the Gallup pollsters conduct a survey in the US to find out American adults' views of the most trusted professions, or the degree to which they trust various professions. And every year for decades, physicians have been in the top 5. Usually they come in second after nurses among the most trusted profession. And for that reason, their testimonies about near-death experiences, I think, can carry some particular weight, both because they're trusted as a profession and because they have knowledge of the brain, the body, some sense of how things work medically. And related to that is that because in many cases, near-death experiencers' views about the nature of the universe change after they've had a near-death experience, how physicians look on the subject of philosophical materialism, the idea that everything is fundamentally material and things like subjective experience, subjective human experience are the product of the brain, how they view that philosophy, which is taught pretty much or either explicitly or implicitly in medical schools, but may not be compatible with the experiencer's views after having a near-death experience. So today we have 3 MDs who have not presented at an IANDS conference before, although both Anoop and Pete have done presentations that are available on ISGO. And if you want to hear their experiences in more detail, you could check out those after this presentation, but this will give you a very good introduction to their experiences. And we also have Jean Hausheer. So what we're going to do is I've asked them to prepare answers to a few specific questions so that their presentations will be somewhat parallel and you'll be able to kind of compare their answers. First, I'm asking them to talk about their history, concisely leading up to their NDEs. Who were they personally and professionally? What were their most important values and goals in life leading up to their NDEs? And specifically, what were their beliefs regarding philosophical materialism? And then about their NDE itself, to concisely report on the physical circumstances, but then go into detail about the actual near-death experience and give us a really good sense of what they actually experienced in their NDEs. And after effects, in detail, in what ways do they perceive themselves to have been transformed specifically because of the NDE, not necessarily because possibly having come close to death, but the NDE itself. And specifically, what effects did the NDE have on their most important values and goals in life and their beliefs about philosophical materialism? And then how did their NDE affect their subsequent views and practice of medicine? And if they wanted to give one take-home message to physicians and maybe patients and others regarding NDEs, what would it be? So that's a lot to ask for 20 minutes, but they're each going to have 20 minutes, and that's going to leave us with 25 minutes of Q&A at the end. So as attendees, if you have questions, please be sure to put them in the Q&A, not in the chat. the chat is for technical things. The Q&A is for the content of our presentations. And I'll monitor those. And I want to say one other thing before we get started, and that is that we're going to go in the order of how early the NDE occurred. So Jean is going to go first, and then Anoop, and then Pete. And I also want to say that Anoop's experience, as you'll see, did not involve actually coming physically close to death, but it characterizes the research that has shown that identical experiences to NDEs occur under other circumstances than actually being either physically or under the threat of being close to death. And so his experience illustrates that that identical quality, which I think you'll see when you hear about it. So I think that's everything. If you all can remember anything that I should say before we get started.
No, that sounds good.
We're good to go? Okay, so Jean will go first, then Anoop, and then Pete. So Jean, take it away.
Glad to be here. Thank you. So I was a 20-year-old medical student at the time of my NDE, and I was in the midst of very challenging coursework, intensive study. I was very single-focused, intent on my completion of medical school and residency. So that was my whole end game right there. And regarding philosophical materialism, that was not something we ever discussed or debated in the realm of medical school around the time of my NDE, but that was 44 years ago. I've also not heard over my years as a career physician, other medical students talk about it. I'm sure they have, but I'm simply unaware of that. Physically, at the time of my NDE, I had a Jacksonian variant of Guillain-Barré syndrome, presumed from an earlier Zika virus upper respiratory infection. So Guillain-Barré syndrome is known in some individuals to progress to the point of that person needing mechanical ventilation to support the life of that individual. So in my physical situation at the time of my NDE, that was compounded by the fact that I had been administered a sequential consecutive overdose of intravenous physostigmine just prior to my NDE, which likely contributed substantially to my respiratory arrest. That young neurologist later came in and found me following my NDE, and he didn't know he'd had that. But anyway, he had totally apologized to me in front of the neurosurgeon for his very grave error. So my NDE occurred 44 years ago when I was a med student. I was hospitalized at the time with an evolving descending paralysis. So it was started up here and in the head area and the eyes, and then descended. So the team of expert physicians at the time had determined that I either had a Jacksonian variant of Zika virus induced Guillain-Barré or instead had a form of myasthenia. So to help better isolate which of these issues would be more likely, I was given intravenous physostigmine multiple times, which is a test they use in diagnosing myasthenia. Shortly after the last dose of physostigmine was given, I was transported by wheelchair just a short ways over to the respiratory department of the hospital for pulmonary function studies. And the reason for that testing had been prior arranged because my ability to basically breathe at that point had greatly deteriorated even before the physostigmine had been given to me. So once in the respiratory department, and while I was talking with the respiratory therapist, while in mid-sentence explaining how difficult it had become to do just basic breathing, I simply collapsed and unable to breathe any further. So from my perspective, though, I fully awoke to a scene from inside of a dark movie theater. Everything I looked at directly was exquisitely clear and incredibly detailed. While there was sort of like a dark tunnel, sort of like an outer ring surrounding anything I looked at, I was able to see spherically 360 degrees all at once, which seemed remarkable to me, that I could see through ceilings and walls and rooftops. I felt like I was on the rooftop of the hospital at this point, and it was with great ease that I could see. I could also hear the respiratory therapist located maybe 30 feet or so below me. She was frantically striving to resuscitate what was, in my mind, just an empty body shell of a young brunette woman below. And I really hated that she was so desperately trying to revive something that had nothing living inside of it anymore. I was really quite frustrated that I could only watch and I couldn't just like tell her this. And why didn't she understand that? The next thing I saw was up and to my right, there arose just an amazing, incredibly beautiful, loving ball of brilliant living light. It seemed to be expanding larger and larger and brighter as I gazed onto it. At no time did this ball of light make me travel towards it. Instead, I just instinctively could not wait to travel towards it just by desiring to do so. The speed of travel was amazing. The closer I came towards it, the purer the love, the stronger my desire to arrive evolved, and the surrounding darkness that I told you about a moment ago was gradually going away. Midway in transit to this amazing ball of living light, my soul, or who I am and always have been, stopped dead in my tracks at the realization of, oh my gosh, I'm dying. Meanwhile, an immense level of comfort and reassurance overwhelmed my realization of my own earthly death, and I simply could not wait or delay my transit towards the amazing place of pure love and peace. So as I felt these feelings by desire, I continued onward towards the living place of light until I arrived all in. Once there, I was greeted by a number of beautiful, incredibly happy, just exuberant, colorful, iridescent souls. We each very much resembled human characteristics, although we weren't exactly alike. At that same time in my life, I had not yet experienced the earthly death of any of my relatives or best friends of any kind. So today, I still couldn't tell you who any of these souls were, but they greeted me heartily as if they'd always known me. Upon arrival to this place, it had an unmistakable familiarity. It was home. In fact, it was all of our homes. In fact, it was the place from where we had all originated. Much like when back here on Earth, you know, you come home from work each night and you cross the threshold of your doorway, you know you're home. You don't say it aloud, you just know. That's how I felt. I had been to this place before. It was comfortable, it was glorious, and my arrival was like a huge homecoming. Job well done. They were rejoicing with me. I could still see everywhere and anywhere I desired, and I too was every bit as colorful and beautiful and iridescent as each of these glorified souls were. I'm not implying that we all looked alike, because it wasn't the case. The loving pure light of this place, though, shone through each of us, and God dwelt in and among each of us and in all things in this place. There was complete absence of anything evil or dark or bad. I was able to telepathically communicate with multiple glorified souls all at once throughout my time. Such a girl thing to do, to be able to talk to so many people all at once. The other striking aspect of these glorified souls was that we each had a very heightened degree of wisdom and knowledge. In no way am I suggesting that our knowledge or wisdom was equal to that or greater than that of God himself, because that was never the case. Instead, I'm saying that our wisdom and knowledge far exceeded that of us here in the earthly realm. I greatly enjoyed my various conversations with these glorified souls in this place of pure loving wonder and joy. And meanwhile, just in general terms, I was given to know that I had the option to stay there eternally, or I could return to my earth suit below and complete the gift of life. This created a dilemma in my mind, as the body below was paralyzed and not breathing. In general terms, I was given to know that this situation would resolve over time, shouldn't really affect my decision process. I also, though, wondered what my earthly occupation was supposed to be, as the situation below seemed really implausible for completion of any medical school or practice of medicine. And just again, in general terms, I was given to know that indeed it was my calling to become a physician, and that would come to pass should I choose to return. The other very overbearing issue in my mind was I had never, ever wanted to leave this amazing place of beautiful souls and companionship. And again, I was just given to know that in general terms, I shouldn't be concerned. They would still be there upon my return from the gift of life, and I wouldn't be judged either way in my decision. So while they're in this heavenly realm, we glorified souls were, just in general terms, aware of things going on back at earth. With those that we loved and cared about. So things like sadness or anguish or despair or heartache, they don't exist in this heavenly place. And although I didn't request this, I was given to know the very deep heartache and anguish of my parents, should I choose to stay. And that in general terms, these feelings would overcome, over time, lessen and become more manageable. So I further contemplated the aspects of a life well lived when I considered that I had never become a physician or a bride or a wife or a mother or a grandma. And my heart really longed to learn the many lessons of each of those and the other chapters in the book of life that I would be taught. So after I considered all of those many aspects of that very important decision, I decided I really would love nothing more than to complete the gift of life. And then suddenly, and with great authority, an immense voice permeated all things in this heavenly place and said to me directly, "Return. It's not your time." So what happened next was that more rapidly than the blink of an eye, who I am and I always will be, or my soul, traveled back from this place, back here to earth, which by contrast has that mix of light and dark. And like sliding into home plate, I slammed most firmly back into my exact assigned earth suit, which had since been moved and transported to a different part of the hospital. So I was now in intensive care. I awoke to an emergency team who shouted aloud, "She's back, she's back." And tears of sheer joy and relief rolled down their faces. I could feel very much all my human attributes immediately back. And I hated that breathing tube down my windpipe. I motioned to write on a piece of paper as soon as I could. I told these people I really wanted to see my dad. My dad arrived shortly thereafter. He was an OB/GYN physician at the same hospital. I was extubated amazingly in just a few hours after my reentry to Earth. And once alone, I talked with my dad about what had happened to me. So I was hoping he wouldn't think I had lost my mind, as I knew I hadn't. Turns out, my dad shared his NDE with me, which I had never heard from him. Back when he was 4 years old, he developed meningitis, high fever, and he lapsed into a deep sleep for a number of days in their rural family farm up in Iowa. Dad had met and spent time with Jesus and other glorified little younger people. They weren't toddlers from what he described, but like me, they were sort of like young adults. Sounds like the same place I had visited. I asked why he never had told me about this huge thing before now, and he just said he didn't think I would understand, so he'd never told me. I had been down total for about 17 minutes time total in my respiratory arrest, but from my perspective, I'd probably spent the good portion of a day in heaven. I never did see Jesus, but very much look forward to that someday. I've been asked what the one thing would have been to cause me to want to stay there in heaven. That would have been music. I would have absolutely stayed. Music has always been the thing that brings me to my knees. So I was hospitalized, all told, for close to a month with Jacksonian variant of Guillain-Barré. As I prepared to discharge back to home, the team of specialists gathered somberly in my room to explain I could not return to medical school. I wouldn't be physically able to do that for probably a year or longer, perhaps, or maybe never, because I still had to learn to walk and do a lot of things over. Perhaps they thought I could consider a sabbatical or something else, but they advised me to maybe do something other than that. I thanked them for their advice and I asked them for an open-ended return to school letter from them. I assured them I would use common sense in my return to normal life. I returned to med school upon discharge from the hospital. As each day I seemed to recover by leaps and bounds. It did really take me a full year to feel as though I was fully recovered from the whole ordeal. I didn't have any residual issues. I did graduate on time from medical school in the summer of 1981. I've practiced medicine now for over 40 years as an ophthalmic surgeon, and I serve as part-time missionary overseas, mostly in Africa, as well as locally and in other nations as well. It's really been my greatest professional joy, spreading God's light where there is otherwise darkness throughout my career. While I may not recall what I had for dinner 18 nights ago, I've had perfect recall of my NDE 44 years ago. I'm happily married, 6 grown adult kids, 7 grandkids. One time I told my pastor following my ophthalmology training at Mayo Clinic about my NDE. He cut me off. He told me that what happened to me was merely lack of oxygen and that I should not speak of it again. So after that gut punch, I sought on my own over my lifetime to study research on my own, and I couldn't find anything back 44 years ago about anybody that had these divine appointments. That's what I always called it because I didn't know what else to call what happened to me. So my go-to source over my life has really been scripture, and that remains as such today. So in fall of 2013, I attended an annual 4-state ophthalmology conference that I've never missed in my whole career. And while there were a couple of colleagues gathered at a coffee break. My friend, ophthalmology friend, John Hagen, was there, and he told us he was going to do a 1-year series on the topic of NDE, told us what that was because I didn't know that term. And he thought that physicians in general should be made more aware of what this is. He asked if any of us knew a physician perhaps that had this happen. I kept my poker face on, I stayed silent, and I had just comfortably tucked away my own NDE all these years. And I just had personally enjoyed being quiet. And I thought, you know, that's not right for me to do that. But then I thought there's no way to accurately describe what happened to me and do it any justice. And I didn't want people to judge me either, as had happened earlier. I sat through some more lectures and I argued with God because I was yakking with him about my dilemma, and I lost that argument with God that day, as is always the case. He argued back and he pointed out to me, rightly so, that my NDE was not given to me so I could just selfishly stuff it inside, and instead offered others a message of hope. So I located my friend at the next coffee break, John, and I sat him down and I told him what had happened to me, and he was thrilled. He said, Jean, go read. Go join IANDS, go read about them. Go read the works of Jeffrey Long, go look at the enderf.org website, as well as many other subject experts. We went on and told me about research. I was amazed at how much had evolved over the last 44 years, and have very much enjoyed reading the NDEs of other people as well. So this is my first IANDS conference, by the way. So Aftereffects, I have evolved since my NDE into a person who fully realizes the tremendous gift of life itself that we are each given here. And I'm also very keenly aware that many are not afforded the gift of life to the same extent. Life itself is brief compared to eternity itself. The purpose of life here remains our quest to help, honor, and serve all of life here in our journey forward. And life isn't about me. And it's also not about you either. Instead, life is about helping others along the way, especially in the difficult times we all inevitably encounter. Life here is designed to be full of a mix of good and evil, easy, hard, life, death. We're also very imperfect as humans, and that is by God's design. I think those of us NDE experiencers offer the residue of our human experience on the face of this planet, as by themselves, they're mere anecdotal messages of enduring hope to others. I had tucked away many lessons learned by my NDE throughout much of my life. However, at times of birth or death, or the highs and lows of life itself, or in between, I've very certainly further contemplated lessons from my NDE and studied scripture itself. I've always been keenly drawn to sit with the dying and talk with them easily as they graduate from life. I was given the unique privilege of personally sitting at the side of each of my parents at the time of their deaths, where I was able to give them permission to go in peace and graduate from a life well lived. My dad passed in 93 at the age of 63, and my mother just recently passed in May of this year at the age of 91. So the tremendous gift given to me directly here by God was that the two people who were here at my arrival onto earth, at the gift of my own life, I was able to be with each of them as they departed the same earth at the very moments of their departure. Prior to my NDE, I would say I would characterize my habits and routines as being conversational and prayer throughout my day. Following my NDE, my habits and routines evolved into a much deeper, more throughout the whole day type of prayer communication. I basically yik yak with God all day long. That's how I do it. The scientific and spiritual worlds, in my views, have both the same thing to offer. They both provide differing but complementary ways of answering the greatest of the world's questions, and both can coexist happily within the mind of an intellectually inquisitive person living now here in the 21st century. Both science and the spiritual world seek out the same thing, that is truth itself. And Albert Einstein once said, quote, "Science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind." Heaven is real. I've been there and I'm back here. I'm alive and well, and I'm willing to talk about it. So have several other individuals I've noticed. My NDE didn't happen because I'm special or I'm deserving, because I'm not special and I'm not deserving. I'm far from perfect. Who we each are, or our souls, or our essence, our eternal or meaning without end. Where we journey to from here on earth, where we go from here, really does matter a great deal. And the God that I have come to know and recognize and deeply love here on earth throughout my life loves just doing miracles in a lot of different ways. So thank you for the time to spend with you today. I'll close with that because I think my 20 minutes is there.
You're so right, Jean. You're just exactly on time, and I could not have been better. Thank you so much. And I have some questions for you for later on. And in fact, I did forget to say that when we get to the Q&A part, we'll start with you three, if you have, and me, if we have things we want to discuss, and then we'll go to the questions. And we already have one great question too, that I know you'll all have input on, as well as me. So thank you so much, Jean. Okay, so next is Anoop. And so Anoop, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Jan. Let me pull up my questions here. So who was I personally and professionally? So personally, before this, I guess, near-death-like experience, I was in medical school at the time, in my late 20s, and probably just an angsty guy, just a guy who didn't quite buy what the adults around me, especially adults in school and in society, and the common stories that circulate in society, I just didn't buy. I kind of felt like it was crap, to be honest. It was so thin, it was so insufficient, and yet I still didn't know, what it actually is, like what life actually is. And these kinds of doubts like burned within me. And really, since I was a kid, they had burned within me. And professionally, as I said, I was in medical school at third or fourth year. What's interesting is I don't actually remember the exact year or the date. And many of those kind of chronological details are not part of my memory. But I know it was in my late 20s. It was in medical school, towards the end of medical school. And in medical school, I had kind of hoped that, okay, my attitude was, let's see what the doctors know. That was kind of my thing in medical school. And I didn't get any of the answers. I didn't exactly think I would, but I kind of hoped against hope that I would. And I was still kind of just like, I guess, thinking or trying to figure things out. That's where I was. And let's see, beliefs with regard to materialism. I didn't believe it was true. I had thought about materialism, although not specifically in those words, but just the idea that, there are these experiences that we call physical or mental, and that the brain creates mind or mental experience. I'd kind of considered all these and never found that convincing. I had been around people since I was a kid, many people who had experiences that were not consistent with materialism. And so I didn't believe it was true, but I wasn't to the point where I said, I know it's not true and I'm convinced. It was still kind of this open intellectual question. And then so the actual experience was, I was home from medical school and in my bedroom, and I was actually reading some philosophy at the time, because my attitude was like, what the heck is all this? Like, that was just my general disposition in life. Like, what is all this what is this crap almost? That was like my perspective. And as I was reading this, something caught my interest. I don't remember exactly what it was. And so my attention kind of zoomed in on it. And that moment of hyper focus kind of lit an explosion. And the only way I can describe it is there was an explosion, and everything from the known world kind of disappeared. And it felt like I was sitting in the sun, which may be a strange phrase, but I can't think of any other way to phrase it. And it just seems right. And when I say I, this I was not the body, this I was kind of a subtle personality. And the subtle personality itself was of the nature of a blaze. And so it was like what this identity was, is something like a blaze within another blaze, or an aspect of a larger blaze. And I'm not really keeping track of time, so we'll see where this goes, Jen.
I'll help you with that.
All right. So, and in this experience, all the angst and all the questions disappeared, just vanished as if they never existed. And which is not to say I intellectually understood all the answers, but it felt as if there was a desire to understand intellectually any of these things, that it was all, possible at that point. So it was like the largest sigh of relief that one could imagine, in a sense. And this was simply it. It was just like a deep orangish kind of blaze, and just pure, I don't know, just being. It was just maybe like it was just so right, something like that. And I don't know how long that was. And then at some point I realized that, or I don't know if I realized that, but there was this momentum to keep moving forward, right? So naturally, this identity that I'm calling me now, this identity started moving forward. And at some point, it was moving to a place where then I recognized that there was no coming back after kind of moving beyond a certain point, beyond a certain threshold. And at that point, there was a fear at that point for the individual identity. There was a fear that, oh, okay, this is it. And yet, despite this fear, there was much more of a tremendous, I don't want to say rightness or completion, that it was uncontainable, or I could not ignore that, so to speak. So there was just kind of flowing as water might flow towards whatever was next. And just when it seemed like there was this point of no return, then another blaze kind of blazed forth. I know I'm using the word blaze a lot, but I don't know what else to use. And so another blaze, and it's all just this deep orangish kind of color, and instilled in me the impression that this would not necessarily that this wouldn't be fair, that there was still, such and such to think about, and there was still, the general feeling was there was still work to be done, and it wouldn't be fair. And this sense of identity didn't want to hear that, right? It's because it's almost like a relief. It's like taking off the 5-ton backpack and all the questions and all those kinds of things. And so it didn't want to hear that. And at the same time, you couldn't ignore that, I guess I would say, right? Because it was true. There was a truth to it, and you can't ignore truth. So it was true. And this blaze or being, or however we want to put it, was just so without bias in what it was saying. It wasn't saying it to like convince me of anything, or to force me, or to show me something. It was just kind of laying out the facts And so it's almost like, like when an innocent child tells you something, like you can't ignore it because it's so true. It was kind of like that. There was this moment of hesitation because of the truth of this, and that moment of hesitation is all it took for everything to re-implode, so to speak. And the identity then again was kind of encased or represented as this body. I was back in the bedroom, and the sense of perception had changed at that point. Whereas the perception was traditionally, like, I thought it was happening from the scientific perspective through the eye, the whole photons ricocheting off the object and going to the retina, and that whole story, that all changed. The kind of seeing, hearing, smelling, and the way the world was perceived changed, such that the body kind of was also part of the perception, as opposed to the station of perception. And it took, I don't know, I don't have a great sense of time here, but I remember at some point going into the bathroom and not recognizing the guy, because he just looked much happier, and he just like all the tension had gone from him, kind of. And then, so I remember kind of doing this double take, it taking a while to reassociate, and then started probably like a 10+ year, this was before my residency training in emergency medicine. A little bit after that, I got married. I started my residency and went through an incredibly intense process, lasted about 10+ years or so, of trying to reintegrate into, I guess, the culture and the beliefs and the, I don't know, just the rigidity of the cultural beliefs in our world culture. And so that's the detail of the experience, some of the detail. So in terms of being transformed by it, who did you become? Well, so things made sense in the sense after that, like all the questions and the reading and all that stuff I had made sense, because and even going to medical school, which was almost like an afterthought, made sense because I really wanted to kind of organize and make sense of all this. And after this, the perspective was there, the kind of firsthand experience was there to kind of start making sense of all this and communicating about it, which is what I love to do. It just happens to be what I love to do. I've always loved to talk about this stuff and engage about this and trying to figure out how this fits with this and all these kinds of things. It just became much more doable afterwards. So that's, and I was also not bored anymore. I would say that before this, most of my life, in many ways, my inner life was characterized by boredom and angst. I always felt like there was so much time, no matter what happened, there was so much time, like I was waiting around for something, like you're waiting for a bus that never comes. And after that, I haven't felt like that. It feels much more lively and, can kind of play with things a lot more. So let's see, your most important values and goals in life, beliefs regarding materialism. Okay, so goals, to me, it would be to communicate like a broader framework for life that goes beyond this kind of body-mind divide or science and spirituality divide. I think all of these are basically perspectives. One can take any number of perspectives on what we call life, but it just depends on what our biases are, what assumptions we wish to hold on to, what assumptions we dare not question, because that goes with our religion from childhood or our scientific assumptions or whatever it may be. So I really enjoy playing with all of these and kind of breaking down assumptions. Materialism, I feel, is an absolute embarrassment to the human intellect. Like, I just can't say it any softer than that. It is an absolute embarrassment to the human intellect and to a society that believes it's advanced. To think that the brain itself creates experience. So the brain itself, first of all, you have to believe the brain itself is not an experience. I don't know how you get there without some really messed up thinking to believe the brain itself is not an experience. But assuming it's not, and it exists prior to experience, to then believe it creates something called experience, which we itself cannot define what experience is, I just think it's absolute madness. And we're just afraid to kind of look at the deeper possibility that some of these dichotomies don't exist: mind, matter, life, death, human, divine, or all of these kinds of dichotomies that we superimpose on the world. So, and I say that not only because of my experience, but there's evidence for this. You can look at, if you look up the Division of Perceptual Studies at UVA, you'll see tons of studies of kids remembering past lives. You can see stories of people who have organ transplants who then start to have the memories of the death of the people who had donated their organs, right? So it seems to be that mind and experience seems to come along with what we call physicality, the physical organ, and on and on and on. I'm sure IANDS has a lot of resources that we can look at. You have to ignore the evidence to believe materialism. You have to have your head in the sand. So that's where I stand with regard to that. Subsequent views and practice of medicine, I believe that our model of anatomy is radically incomplete. We have substituted a human body for a human being in our model of anatomy. And right now, if you are a patient, we are modeling you as a body and not as a being. And that is at best, a radical and grave incompleteness. And it is in that difference between the body and the being that well-being and rapport and narrative medicine and integrative medicine and all of these live. But we haven't had the courage to say, hey, you know what? We don't understand all these models of anatomy from India and China and Thailand. And so we're just going to ignore them. That's what we're doing now. But if we go deeper into the physics and the philosophy, we can develop a more complete model of human anatomy that allows us to bridge this false divide between mind and matter. And I think that has direct implications on chronic disease, on physician well-being. The physician suicide rate is twice that of the general population. Can you believe that? On what we call mental health and mental illness. I don't know how in biomedical education, when you have a model of the human being that's based on the body, you can't talk about mental illness or mental health with authority, in my view, because we don't know what the mind is. If I were trying to talk to you about kidney health and kidney illness, and I couldn't tell you what the kidney is, nor where the kidney is, you would question me, I hope. And yet here we are talking about mental health and mental illness, but we don't learn what the mind is in medical school. What is the mind? Where is the mind? What are the ranges of mind? How do we access these ranges of mind? How does it relate to the body? None of this is addressed. So and how much suffering is here, which is not to say suffering is not real. Suffering is real. All the more reason to complete our medical education, and not just in medicine, but across the board in the sciences, and look at our philosophical assumptions, look at the research that we have been unwilling to see because it threatens our expertise, and start to integrate that. So let's see, take home message, the single most important message to other physicians and others. That's a hard one. Maybe I'll just say that these experiences, that you have had these experiences, that it's not just the people on this panel or some people, that you have had these experiences, maybe not in the same way, maybe not the same flavor, but it may be on the periphery of your awareness. And it's happening right now, by the way, in the periphery of your awareness. It's just that in our society, we're trained like the racehorse with the blinders to look in a particular way. And therefore, we don't notice the completeness of the picture that is here right now, right? This experience is not something that happens somewhere else. The canvas in which the so-called NDE experience happens is the exact same canvas in which this experience is painted, where you're seeing a screen and a body and hearing audio. It's the exact same canvas. It's simply a matter of shifting the frame of perception, shifting the frame of attention, really, which then shifts the frame of perception. So there's nothing special happening here. It's just a matter of training our attention in a different way and educating our society in a different way. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Anoop. And you did really well. You actually have one more minute, but it sounds like you've said what you really want to say, and
Yeah.
maybe Pete can use the extra minute in his in his presentation. Thank you so much. Okay, so Pete, your turn. You're on. Go for it.
I can always use an extra minute, and thank you for that. And punches thrown, that was great. I like that. That was fantastic stuff. And Jean, that was beautiful. I'm so thankful to be able to listen to both of you today. That's just tremendous way to spend a Saturday afternoon. So I'll go through your questions, Jan. They're fantastic. And I guess starting looking at them here, who was I before this happened is kind of a complex question. I'm a forensic pathologist and a neuropathologist, and I've conducted thousands of autopsies, investigated thousands of deaths, cut thousands of brains as a neuropathologist and a neuroscientist. And my career was really taking off, and it was a major focus of my life. As most physicians are, when you get into going to medical school, is a self-selecting group of people. You're overachievers, you're a little bit type A, competitive, not necessarily competitive with the world around you, but certainly hyper competitive with yourself. You take failure as a personal insult and motivates you to become greater at what you do. And that was sort of my MO at the time. It was my career. I was in that sort of upswing phase of the young career. I've been practicing since 2004. I was a professor of anatomy and neurobiology at a big medical school in Boston, and had all the academic checks and won teaching awards and written books. So it was that was the focus of my life at the time, and was work. So that's kind of where I was. Philosophically, I was an atheist, hardcore. You couldn't convince me otherwise. And with my work, just really reinforced that, because I can cut a brain and I can put it out for you, and I'll ask you, where's consciousness? Where is the soul? This doesn't exist. There's no proof for it in this brain. And everything that we think about as that process of consciousness, death, is the dying brain. And it can be very easily explained through hypoxia, the chemical reactions that happen as the brain begins to die, which do happen. But we get into confusing awareness with consciousness, but that's maybe another day. So that's where I was, at the time, and wasn't really anything I ever thought about. Wasn't part of my life to worry about these kind of questions. I was more concerned with getting publications on my CV and finishing a book that I had just written with a colleague, that we were about to start a big book tour, and which raised some eyebrows at my institution, and I had to have some fight for my academic freedom of speech. And so I was involved in some really heavy academic nonsense that at the time was really enjoyable. You live for that kind of stuff in that world. It was my wife's 50th birthday, and we had gone to Costa Rica to celebrate. And my wife and I have been together 26 years, and have some significant differences. And I thought this trip to Costa Rica was going to be a resort trip, sitting on a beach, sipping umbrella drinks and surfing. And it was really 10 days of Survivor, which is really her speed. She loves to be out and being in nature and just conquering and surviving. And that's not me. I like to be comfortable. But so we go on this whitewater rafting trip, and I'm terrified. And I should preface the story a little bit with the idea that I grew up in Maine, or always around lakes and water. I was terrified of water. I hate water. I hate being around it. I was always terrified I was going to drown. I always found excuses to not be in the water, because I just always felt like I was going to drown. The other thing I used to do, and I never put these pieces together until after this, and this might make sense after the story. I used to get really bored in school. And one of the things I would do is I would hold my breath, watch the second hand on the clock, see how long I could hold my breath, and then try to beat that record. And that's how I spent most of my elementary and middle school. And I always thought, someday I'm going to need this. Someday I'm going to need this. So fast forward 30 years, 40 years down the road, and I'm on this whitewater rafting trip, and it was one of the most technically difficult rivers in the world. And we had our 10-year-old son with us, which I'm thinking as we're going down this river, this is probably not great parenting, but he had a great time. And we flipped, and I went under. And you know, I didn't panic. I did all the things you're supposed to do, put my feet up and coming through the rapid, and I thought, oh, this is kind of fun, you know, I'm bouncing around these big waves. And then I got pulled under a couple of times. I got caught in a hydraulic, and I couldn't get out, and I was stuck at the bottom of the river. And I came down several times, and there was a point, got to the chase of the story, there was a point where I was drowning, and I knew it. And I thought to myself very clearly, I remember thinking, you're drowning, and this is, you're dying, this is it, this is the end. And I was thinking, shouldn't I be more upset about this? This is actually very calming. And I thought about the autopsies I had done on people who had drowned, and I thought, well, this is a lot what you read about in books, that this is supposed to be a very peaceful way to die. And then I remember thinking, well, what the heck is taking so long? And I'm underwater, and at that point, everything stopped. And I was next to this huge boulder, and which was under the water, and all the bubbles had stopped. Everything stopped. And I moved my hand through the bubbles, and they all just sort of moved around my hand in this very kind of weird way. And then there was this bright light. And I tell it sequentially, but I think Jan might understand that all this is happening simultaneously. The human brain processes it sequentially. So, and I describe it as, you know, we'll hear these various, I used to think it's very cliche, like a sunset or a sunrise, but those are the only, it wasn't like that. But these are the only words I have in English language to explain something that's outside of normal human experience. I don't have the words for these. At that point, I was able to see everything around me, 360 degrees. And I see it, but more of experiencing it more than seeing it. I knew that my wife had been pulled out. I knew it was a yellow kayak. I knew it was the guy down the river. I knew my son was in the other boat. I knew the boat behind me was coming to get me. I knew that I had a family member that was going through a very difficult personal crisis that I didn't know about, that I knew about, and I knew it was going to be okay. So that was very sort of happening while I'm in this light situation, and just this incredible overcoming feeling of love, and a voice saying, they're going to be okay. So I get really emotional still, not because it's upsetting, but because I'm in that moment of that beauty. It was just so beyond experience. And I knew my family was going to be okay. And the voice said, they don't need you. They're going to be fine. And that was sort of a moment where I just was like, this is amazing. And just kept repeating, they're going to be okay. They don't need you. You're done. Good job. Like Jean was saying. At that point, I cut a little bit further ahead. The voice in the back of my head was shouting, you're just hypoxic. You're just hypoxic. Hold your breath. You have to beat your record. You have to beat your record. And at that point, the light just sort of vanished. There was a giant sucking sound, and I slammed up against the rock and popped out of the water. When I came up, the boat behind me was almost to me, but I couldn't see anything. I say my vision was like a Viewmaster, one of those old Viewmasters. I could see and it was gone, see and it was gone. I couldn't see motion. And we were through that rapid. And as the water slowed and the boat came up to me, the guide in the boat put the paddle out for me to grab. And I remember reaching up and being, you know, in moments of blackout thinking, if I don't grab this paddle, I am done. And that's the last thing I remember. And then what I do remember next was being in the boat and not being able to breathe. And we're in the middle of the rainforest. There's no way out of here. Is 28 miles of river is our only exit. And so I immediately slip into this emergency medicine mode, ABCs, airway, breathing, circulation, trying to see if I'm okay. I'm the only doctor for hours, right? And I'm really worried about if I have water in my lungs, because that can cause problems later down the road in the next 24, 48 hours. You can have intense inflammatory reactions in your lungs that can kill you. It's called near drowning. But I felt okay. I didn't feel like I had any water in my lungs. What I realized had happened is I had a laryngeal spasm, and it's something called a dry drowning. So when water irritates your voice box, it closes off, and it's a reflex, and there's nothing you can do about it. And I remember being in the boat, trying to breathe and thinking, that's really great, Cummings. You survived it, you got in the boat, you die in the boat. That's, typical, So knowing that this is a reflex, I'm trying to calm myself down. And I start being able to get little breaths in. And eventually I was able to breathe. We continued down the river like nothing had really happened. And I didn't really think much of it the rest of the day because, I got my son, I got my family. I'm trying not to be freaked out by this. And that night when we got back to where we were staying, I remember looking at my Apple Watch, because I'm a kind of a health freak, and I'm obsessed with my heart rate, sleeping heart rate, resting heart rate. So I have a constant awareness of my heart rate. And I looked at my Apple Watch, and I had 8 minutes of unrecorded heart rate in that time period. Now, it takes the caveat, it's an electronic device, sure. It also takes the heart rate at intervals. So at least in those 8 minutes, I had a period of time where I had no registered heart rate. It never happened before in that watch. It never happened after that in that watch. It didn't happen the rest of the time. We were on the river. And at that point, I started to think something happened. And we continued with the vacation. The next day, we're going down the river, and I'm a little freaked out by being in the river at this point. And we're paddling down. My son says, "Look at that butterfly on the boat." And I look over, and it's this huge blue butterfly. And I said, "Finn, that's not a butterfly. That's a bird." And he's like, "No, it's a butterfly." And it was so big, and it was a blue morpho. And I didn't know anything about this butterfly until way later, about couple of years later. And it followed us the entire 28 miles down the river. Everybody saw it the whole way. The next day, we were rappelling down some waterfalls. And I don't mean beside them, in them, right? This is my wife. This is a survivor vacation. So we're rappelling down 150-foot waterfalls, and there's the blue morpho by my son the whole way. And so we called it angiogram because my mom died a number of years ago. But so that was really profound. I didn't know about that until coming back, which is kind of where I would jump to the after effects. I was on vacation, didn't really have much on my mind when we came back. And I started to notice I was having a lot of problems with time, judging time, estimating time. And you know how you're doing something, you get lost in it and you forget how much time you spent. That was every moment of my day. And it wasn't so much a problem on vacation, but when I went back to work, when I had a really heavy lecture schedule, I had labs and places I had to be, trains I had to catch, it became a really big problem. I was late for things. I would forget, I would be on my way to teach a class, and I'd run into somebody in the hall and start talking, and 30 minutes would go by. So as I started to notice these time things happening, I realized that something was different. I became very uncomfortable with my career pursuit. Those things weren't important to me anymore. I've written a couple of very bad novels, horror novels, but I say that I was the best character I ever created because I was this piece of paper, and I couldn't identify with that anymore. Those things weren't important to me. And here I was in this intense Boston, malignant academic environment, and it made me physically ill. I just couldn't be there anymore. Jumping off of that, we ended up moving to Maine, where we're from, living in the woods and having a great life. But the after effects were very difficult, and I didn't have a way to deal with it. And so what I actually did is I write, and I ended up writing a book. I don't know if it'll ever see the light of day, but it's about consciousness and the mind. particularly about time, because I don't think it was anything extraordinary, supernatural, or I think I had a hypoxic brain injury, and it's called dyschronometria, and I have difficulty. I have many ways to cope with it now. It's not, it doesn't affect my life, but that was really the catalyst for me to figure out what happened. That pushed me to do what I say, I'm doing my own death investigation of my own consequences of that action. It led me to an incredible world of research that I had no idea existed. Jeffrey Long's book was so incredible. The thing that was the most important for me in terms of turning the corner, because it was a very intrusive, negative experience that I did not want in my life. It completely derailed everything. I changed my course of my career, my life, my relationships. It's difficult to talk to people about it. It's alienating. When I did try to tell people about it, it was like, oh, that sounds really, really horrible. It's a good thing you're still here. Let's get a beer. It wasn't like I needed you to understand it. I just needed you to hear it because I needed to process it. I had no way to, which propelled me to write the book. But the thing that really turned the corner for me was Yolaine Stout's paper, 6 Challenges Faced by Near-Death Experiencers. That was probably the most profound thing I've ever read in my life. And every single one of those, yes. 75% of people who experience have a very hard time integrating this into their lives. And I knew nothing about these experiences other than what I'd seen in movies. I thought everybody came back and it was beautiful and you loved God and you quoted scriptures and everybody was happy, and it was the opposite for me. And so I had a really hard time reconciling that. And so the Stout paper really made me feel very good about where I was and trying to, I'm a newbie. It's only 3.5 years or so post my experience. So I'm still trying to figure this all out. And I'm no great expert or pontiff on it. I'm still struggling. But what it really taught me, and I think really having this issue with being able to separate from time allows me to understand that what we do is we put great importance on the past and on the future, and we focus so much on those two things. That's where our importance is, but the value is here, right now. And getting out of those boundaries of time allowed me to put the importance where the value is, and where I am right now, the people I'm with right now, which I say that death is the gift of death is teaching the ability to let go and to be alive. I mean, what's the point of music? The point of music is to listen. What's the point of life? The point of life is to live. And that really helped me come to grips with who I am as a husband, a father, a human, my place on the planet. So that's been incredible. And I think as physicians, we all try to practice this thing called evidence-based medicine, which we need data and proof to treat patients so that they can get the best care possible. And through that, we really pathologize death. We sterilize it. We try to prevent it. We medicalize it, and we shield ourselves from it. Funerals happen very quickly after death. It's very fast. No one sees the body, and you go very quickly back into life. We're not experiencing death. We've made it so sterile and kept it behind this curtain that we don't get a chance to really experience and celebrate the transformation that is happening. And I think as physicians, it's not our, I think back to all the times as a forensic pathologist, I knocked on doors to tell people that loved ones were dead. I brought people down into the morgue to identify bodies. I've sat with families in very horrible circumstances. And the number one question I've always been asked is, did they suffer? And as a physician, you always say, no, of course not. This was sudden, and we try to comfort them. But I always felt like a liar because I don't know, right? Now I know. And I wish I could talk to those people again and say, look, this is a beautiful thing. And even under these horrible circumstances, the horrible circumstance is a second. The process after that is incredible. And there's nothing to worry about in that regard. And I say that, you know, no amount of, you know, worry will transform your future. No amount of grief is going to transform or fix your past. And you just have to be where you are right now and just and love that. And I think that that is kind of where I am with it now. Did I use up my time? I'm trying to go real fast here. Where am I?
You have another minute or so.
I can hear you, Jen.
I mean, yeah, if there's more that you really want to say, go right ahead.
I can't hear you.
Oh, can you hear me now? You can't hear me?
Can't hear you.
I'm unmuted. So those of you who are listening,
hold on.
Pete and I have talked about electromagnetic effects, and that whenever he talks about his NDE, something goes wrong electronically with his stuff. And it's happening right now. And this is a thing that happens with near-death experiencers, that
I've lost all my sound.
Yeah, what do we do? Let's see. I'm going to suggest that Pete restart. So.
Oh my God. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Let me try something else. Restart.
Yep.
Oh, I got you now. I got you.
Oh,
See,
okay.
And this is, we were talking about, I had this a brand new set of headphones that I mean, not brand, I just had to charge. They died halfway through this, and then this dies.
Pete, while you were trying to get your sound back, I was telling everybody about how you and I have joked about how every time you talk about your NDE, electromagnetic things happen and things break, and you know you have trouble hearing and all that. So they're in on the joke now.
I know. Well, yeah, one time I did this, and my house was hit by lightning. So you know, I got to be careful. This is sunny and beautiful today. I don't have to worry about getting hit by lightning.
No, it's you. Sorry, guy. It's you. It's you, babe. So anyway, it's about time to stop. But if you want to say if anything else is important to you to say before we finish your personal narrative, just go ahead and finish up.
No, I tried to go real fast. I tried to hit the highlight reels and give you the summary. I think we had a really great conversation and with your group in Dallas. So if people want to watch that,
yeah,
it's probably better than what I did today. But I'm good.
I don't know about that. I think they're both good in their own ways. So that's good. So we can move on now to the Q&A part. And I guess I first want to ask if you all would like to comment or ask anything to each other before we go to the audience.
I would, Jan.
Go ahead, Jane.
Hi. So, Pete, are you still an atheist?
Yeah, that's a hard question. You know, I've been approached by, I talked to a lot of different people about it. And the thing that, you know, I had a great conversation with Dr. Long about this, who I just think is a fantastic guy. And the idea that there's many paths up the mountain, and everybody is given, because I get really interested in cross-cultural experiences, looking for evidence to prove this wrong, you know, and how everybody has a unique path and a unique guide, a unique way that they get to that top of the mountain. There are certain things about a lot of different faiths that interest me, and they all have the course and kind of a belief to it. And yeah, I'd like to think more of a philosophically pan-religious. You know, I think they're all interesting and have great points to them all. And I get really interested in Islam for a really long time. I think that's an incredible religion looking back, and the history of Muhammad, the first Muslim, I think is a fantastic book if anybody's ever read that. So no, but you know, I think that there's something there. I always joke, I told Jan that, you know, I didn't get in the club. I got to the velvet ropes and I got tossed. You know, I didn't get into the building. You got in. So
I did. And you know, I have done like what Anoop, you said you'd done. I have studied a ton of different religions because I just felt compelled to really seek that out. And so I did that on my own. No one told me to do that either, but I found that I needed to do that. It seemed very important And so I think that's incredible, you know, as well. I loved hearing both of your stories. You know, this is, like I said, my first IANDS conference. Most of my 44 years, I haven't been able to talk with anybody that ever had one of these other than my own father. And one time I talked with Tony. I'm not sure how to say his last name. Cicero.
Sicoria.
Sicoria. There we go. There we go. He and I talked a long time ago, but, and then I have talked to Jeffrey Long as well. But I've had very little interaction. I've just kind of put my little blinders on, or my little bubble, and just on ophthalmology all these years. But I really liked what you had to say. So who said that to you about your hypoxic? Was that your own voice? Do you think your voice telling you that? Or was that
yeah, it was, yeah. Well,
yeah.
I think it was mine, because you know, it was in this moment, and it was at the time where it was starting to hear the right, like I've never heard anybody describe it like you did, and this is exactly what happened. The round of applause, you get to the finish line. Yeah, it was incredible, and it was that moment where I never had a choice. No one said, "Do you want to stay or go?" I don't think I got that far. I don't know how it happened, but I think it was myself yelling, in the back of my head that, you're just hypoxic. And that's how I interpreted it. I didn't feel like it was outside of me.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I had a question for Anoop also, if I could. My question was, so how long did this last? If you said that, I didn't catch it. And were these like sunspots that you were in? Was there any heat involved, or was it just beautiful and colorful? Was it just only orange? Or I was trying to understand. I'm a visionary, I'm a visionary. You can imagine that. But I just really wanted to understand better kind of what that was like.
There was no heat. I would definitely not say it was just orange. I would take out the word just. It was, okay. I don't know, it was a lot, but the only, I guess, physical descriptor I could give is a blaze. Like it was a blaze, and it felt right, and it felt like just being. That's the best way. I wish I could use more adjectives. There's nothing that comes to mind right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
In terms of time, I think in terms of like the linear time that we think of, my best guess is it was minutes, just kind of roughly. Another thing about it, I should say, is that I had been told about these my whole life. I'd been around people who'd experienced this my whole life since I was a kid, and I'd always been told, whatever, like no big deal, like it'll happen at some point, and just kind of move on, don't make a big deal of it. So it took me forever to even think that it was something beyond like. And during that opened up many other experiences, memories of other times when I was a child and other things that had happened. And so a lot of the time scale and everything started to shift after that. But the best I can tell, it was a couple minutes maybe, or something like that in terms of the kind of chronological time.
Were you alone?
Yes, it was just me and my family was in the house, but I was the only one in the bedroom. Yeah.
Well, but when I'm going to call it a transformation. I don't know what else to call it. Is that okay if I call it that? So sure, this transformation that occurred, were you alone by yourself the whole time? Did you encounter other beings? Or
well, there was this other blaze that was also part of this overall blaze. So there was some sense of other being there, but it was not. As I remember it, it was not, there weren't many. There was this, it was just kind of like, like sitting back on the beach and just kind of soaking in the sun, and then somebody being like, hey, you got to get back to work. Or it was almost something like that. It wasn't many people.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jean. And how about Anoop? Pete, did you want to ask or say anything? Don't feel like you have to. I just want to give you the opportunity. We do have several questions from the audience.
I'll just say thank you. I enjoyed hearing both your stories. Thank you for sharing it. I enjoyed this.
Yeah.
I do have a quick question for Jean. I just think there was a lot of similarities with her experience and my experiences. I've never talked to anybody who's had it, so it's really exciting. The thing that I've always found challenging was the idea that when you arrive and it's job complete, thank you and welcome, and then you come back, and how do you reconcile the idea that you're done, but here you are? Because I always say, you ever sneak on a train and not pay the fare? And that, you wait for the conductor to come up the aisle and kick you off. That's kind of how I feel like. I feel like I skipped the timeline, like I'm not supposed to be here, and when they find out, they're gonna come get me. How do you do the new life when everything was finished? I just find that fascinating.
Yeah, so I got to choose, right? Not everybody gets to choose. I did get to choose. I've since over the time, I've been on the enderf.org and read a lot of these because I needed to, just to understand. And I was able to choose. I could not, they would love me the same whether I came back or whether I stayed. They were going to be there when I returned if I chose to come back, or if I stayed. What a blast. So my biggest deal was in the earthly realm. Upon my re-entry back here, the human aspect just flat out told me that the science and the data and the evidence said I would not be able to function really for a good year. And what you don't know is that, like, when I got into residency at Mayo Clinic, there was an ENT resident. I was ophthalmology resident, and there was an ENT that got the same thing I had. And he was on a vent, and he was on one of those beds that rock him. And I went in and I said, Rob, I don't even know you. My name's Jean. I have had the same thing you did. And I'm here standing here to tell you I made it. I survived it, and so can you. And it caused me to really appreciate the fact that I so quickly got back into school, back on my feet, walking. That doesn't make any scientific sense, that I was able to do what I could do. And it wasn't because, like, I'm magical, or nothing like that. I just quickly recovered. And I would say it was hard, it was hard, but I was able. And then the emotional aspect that you're talking about, which, how do you grapple with that? I think it was peaceful to me that my dad had this, and he never told me. And I just felt like, I'm not the only one. And so I think there was several reasons why I felt okay.
Yeah. If I could jump in, I'll suggest too, because I've heard this situation before where the experiencer has the sense that if they stay, it's perfectly fine, and they're finished with life, with earthly life, and everything's good. And if they go back, it's perfectly good. Everything's fine. Everything's wonderful. And so I think one of the challenges of this existence is we think dichotomously. Either you were finished or you weren't. And in that domain, there are possibilities. And it's good any way that you go. Similarly, y'all were like Pete, you said you got the message that your family would be fine, that they would, be devastated for a while, but then they would move on and they would be okay. And that would have been okay. It's also wonderful that you came back and they didn't have to experience that. But it would have been fine the other way too. So it's just really kind of hard for our human brains to get that it can be fine either way. And that there isn't, it's not like you tricked anybody, but
that's what it feels like some days. It feels like
I know it does.
I'm just waiting. When he finds out I'm still here, whoever finds out I'm still here, we're gonna get the hook. Exit stage right.
I hear you. Okay, well,
it's not necessary that we made one choice or another. Like, this is one aspect of ourselves. This is one version of ourselves. So in some ways we can make both choices, and there can be an aspect of us that is locally present, but that is alive in some other way that, might
Hmm.
reconnect or reintegrate, or many possibilities.
That's another important perspective. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so do you feel ready to go to the audience questions? Okay, so first is someone who says, "Hi friends, I've asked this question on a number of occasions at this weekend's gathering. I'm really happy to ask a panel of doctors. I'm a mental health professional who has had STEs. I'm a social worker and a psychotherapist who can't ignore the spiritual, and I believe in integrating the scientific and the mystical. When someone ends up in the psychiatric ward because they had an NDE or another STE that has been misdiagnosed, how do we educate psychiatrists and psychiatric nurses as to what's actually going on? I have compassionate colleagues who are limited by the DSM, that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, for people who don't know in the audience, and scientific evidence base," and says, "Thank you all for your answer." So what suggestions do you have? And then I'll tag on when you all have said what you want to. Or do you want me to start?
I'll go first with that, I guess, because I think having spent my career completely surrounded by death, I think has me a little bit of insight into where that question may be coming from in terms of that. I think the biggest thing that can happen is people like us talking more about this and in a much wider forum. I think these are conversations for grand rounds. These are conversations for palliative care, to get more involved with the death process, have physicians become more involved in death process. I know both my parents died of really long, kind of drawn out cancer deaths, that as soon as it was terminal, the doctors scattered. I never saw either one of my mother and my father's primary care physicians again. Once it was a done deal and it was transferred to hospice and it was going to be, they just left. And as a physician, it's very difficult. I think it's very difficult to deal with deaths of patients because we see it as a failure rather than, like I always say, Jim Morrison said it better than anybody on the whole planet Earth: no one here gets out alive. And it is inevitable. And when we start distancing ourselves professionally from it, like I would do when families came in, and I had to answer the very difficult questions that are uncomfortable. We're uncomfortable because we don't know. We run away from death as physicians and the death process because we just don't know. And I think that if we can do more and I think that we run a real risk even within our certain communities of sniggering and, oh my God, Cummings has lost his mind. But the thing that we have is we have the truth and we have the evidence of the truth. And there's so many, and the thing that really amazed me when my process of investigating my own death, as I say, is the incredible amount of controlled and powerful studies that leave you with no alternative, that this is a transformation, something else happens. And I think that if we're really practicing evidence-based medicine, you can't do that and ignore evidence. Because a lot of times what physicians are seeking is bias confirmation. They're looking for papers to prove how I feel, to prove how I train, because medicine is an apprenticeship. And I do something some way because someone who trained me told me how to do it, and someone who trained them told them how to do it. And it's passed down this way. And we like to think that we're scientists, and we're not. And science should always be openly debated and discussed. And I don't want to get political, but take a subject right now on our planet Earth and tell me that we're actually openly debating and discussing science. We're confirming biases. And we do that in medicine all the time. And I think those would be the ways I might strategize that.
Great, thank you. And
I would offer, Jan, I would just offer to that question that, in medical school around today, they do have good curriculum, I think, evidence-based curriculum regarding, death itself, becoming comfortable with your own death. That's definitely discussed. And you really have to go through that, and they have whole courses on this. And I think it's a mark of a good medical training to have that. But beyond medical school, you know, I'm an ophthalmologist, right? I'm an eye surgeon. So in my little realm, I don't deal with that. So for me, I've had to I'm different than Pete. You know, I've had to go figure stuff out on my own, but I've done that work. And I've broadened my reading, my background, all of that. But I'm not sure that everyone does that. So I think that the more we can, I didn't even know there was a journal of near-death studies until today when I heard that. So I'm going to be going and reading that. I didn't know that. So even though I'm an ophthalmologist, I'll be reading that because I'm interested in it. You know, I think if we can get that in the hands of primary care, nurses, physicians, all of that, those of us that lead in healthcare, I think that would be powerful.
Thanks. And Anoop, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just say that, you know, again, when we're talking about, the question was about DSM, the constructs that we have about mental illness and mental health are based on what knowledge? That's a question we have to answer. What knowledge do we learn in medical school? Not outside by virtue of our other experiences. In medical school, what knowledge do we learn about the mind? Very little, if any, especially beyond the notion of mind as my individual thought or my individual emotion. So, which is why some of the research is going beyond DSM and looking at kind of domains of experience rather than simply these diagnoses that we've created. I can tell you that in my integrating process after this, there were many experiences that could be categorized as depression, as bipolar, as psychosis, as many of these, because my entire way of perceiving and thinking has changed. And so fortunately, I was with someone who's experienced all of this and was frankly bored with my experience because it was decades ago. They integrated many of this stuff and they'd studied this from childhood. You know, they were a Swami in the Advaita Vedanta tradition of India. And so I had that kind of framework that was going along with any experience that unfolded, no matter how strange it may seem. You know, in this overall picture, it was like, yeah, okay, that's B. Okay, yeah, that's C. Okay, yeah, that's D. And then, yeah, okay, that. And even told me things like, yeah, you're never going to think the same way again. And you're, you know, all these little things that make all the difference in the world. And I also started working part-time because my interest in communicating about this, whereas somebody, for example, who doesn't have time to get away, who can't do things part-time, who has nobody who's experienced this, who doesn't have a framework, the more of these things you take away, the more likely it's going to be pathologized and you're going to end up with a diagnosis. Because again, I go back to the basics. We don't know what the mind is, and yet we're talking about mental health and mental illness. And we got to stop. Somebody's got to press pause and say, let's investigate the mind if we're going to start talking about stuff. And to the person who asked the question, until we do that, it's going to be tough to have this conversation because frankly, like some of our salaries as physicians are dependent on these constructs. And same with many of the drugs that we prescribe, pharmaceuticals that we have marketed as antidepressants or anti-this. Not to say people aren't suffering, not to say people have not benefited to some extent from these, but I think some people are benefiting despite the incompleteness of our models and not because of them.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to tag on in the chat. I have listed a few resources. First is a page at the IANDS website about support for NDEs in the healthcare setting, and it addresses many of these issues. Then the book that Jean mentioned, she has a chapter, as do I, The Science of Near-Death Experiences. There are many good books about NDEs, but this one is edited by, and almost all the chapters are by physicians. So it has that credibility among physicians. So I recommend that book. Also, Bruce Grayson's book, After, which just came out a couple months ago. And he's a psychiatrist who has studied, he's absolutely the leading researcher of near-death experiences. And this book summarizes his work in this field in a very accessible way. So I highly recommend that book. And then finally, the American Center for the Integration of Spiritually Transformative Experiences. It's quite a mouthful, but the acronym is ACISTE, pronounced ASSIST. And it's an organization, the mission is to prepare health professionals to be competent around spiritually transformative experiences. And a big part of that is differential diagnosis between mental disorder and spiritual emergence. So that's a topic that you would find if you got involved in their training. I know because I provide that training. So, so there are a lot of resources for people to help educate, and it's wonderful that you're thinking about helping to educate your peers, your medical peers, so that patients get appropriate treatment. So, okay, next question, and we have only, well, actually, I think we've run out of time. It's time for us to stop, and we still have several questions in the chat or in the Q&A.
So Jan, if you want to send the questions to us, maybe we could
Yes,
I them
we
and then
will.
get them to you and you could distribute them back.
Yes,
I don't know.
we'll do that. We'll do that. And I can get access to the list of questions and send them to you, and you can each choose to answer whatever you want to each of them. So I'm just so grateful to all of you for your participation in this panel, and just to let people know that if they want to hear more physicians' experiences, we have past presentations by Mary Neal, an orthopedic surgeon, Eben Alexander, a neurosurgeon, and Tony Sikoria, who I believe also is an orthopedic surgeon, and maybe others as well, but those are the three that are coming to mind. So so they're available as well on the, I think if you go to ISGO or to past IANDS conference listings, you'd be able to get those recordings. So thank you again to all of you, and it's been wonderful being with each of you, and we'll probably be together again sometime soon, I hope.